Welcome. Welcome to Sage for H, and welcome to the IR PhD interview series. In this interview series, the idea is to get into the life world of PhD students who are doing or recently finished their doctoral projects in IR. Today, I have the honor to speak to Dr. Stephanie Winkler. Stephanie, she received her PhD in International Relations from Stockholm University in 2020. In her research, she focuses on the role of concepts in academic and political life, and she specializes specifically in the trials and tribulations of the soft power concept in the context of the ongoing power shift between the United States, Japan, and China. Her dissertation, Conceptual Politics in Practice, How Soft Power Changed the World, received the Best Dissertation Award in the Social Sciences in 2020 from Stockholm University. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you. Very nice to be here.
Yeah, it's very nice to have you here and really awesome. The Best Dissertation Award. So congratulations to that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So who were your supervisors?
I had two supervisors, Professor Linus Hagström from the Swedish Defense University and Professor Mark Reinhardt from Stockholm University.
Wow, awesome. So Linus was your supervisor. That's really great.
One
of the best IR scholars in Sweden, I would say.
He's a very committed supervisor for sure.
Yeah, that's
it's very
really
great
nice
to work with him.
Yeah, awesome. So yeah, really great. The Best Dissertation Award. So we had things to talk about for sure. Let's get down to business, so to speak. And yeah, let's get into the life world of a PhD student. So why did you want to do a PhD in the first place?
Yeah, that's always a good question because I don't think I made necessarily a super informed decision when I started. I knew I was working at the time as a lecturer at Leiden University in the Netherlands, and I knew that I enjoyed teaching very much. And if you want to teach at the university level, you do need a PhD. So that was kind of clear. But aside from this, I don't think I can say that I've spent a lot of time thinking about what it means to do a PhD or how the life of a PhD looks like, what you actually do all day long, and so on and so forth. So I think it's great you're doing this interview series because I think everyone should be very informed before they're actually starting on a PhD. Mm-hmm. That said, I knew that I love thinking, that I love reading, that I love engaging with texts. I enjoyed my master's degree and my master thesis very much, and I knew there was going to be a lot of things that I still wanted to learn more about. So I was driven by quite some curiosity, and I did know that the life of a PhD means that you are able to spend a significant amount of time becoming an expert in something of your own choosing. Mm-hmm. You have a lot of freedom to pursue your interests. And so I really enjoyed that. And together with my teaching position from back then, I knew that I also would want to have an academic career. A vague understanding of this, at least, that I wanted to work at the university because I just really enjoyed everything around it, the education, also the service. To be honest, I was involved in like how an academic program being set up, for example. The program I was teaching at was very young still, so we had a lot of input actually in its development. So I enjoyed all of these things, and that I think kind of meant that when I had an email in my inbox from my master thesis supervisor that there's a project in Sweden set up by Linus Hagström, the professor, that is looking for a PhD candidate, I knew this is going to be a good project to apply for.
That's awesome. So it was not so informed, or you hadn't really been contemplating it for a long time, but there was an underlying curiosity and passion for teaching and thinking and interesting, and one thing led to another.
Yeah, pretty much that way. And I was in Sweden very quickly. I think the application was in the beginning was due on the 1st of December, and I had an offer 8 days later, and I had 4 or 5 days to decide, and then I was supposed to be in Sweden as quickly as possible. So packing up my suitcases and just going for Stockholm.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, you must have been a really bright student because it's quite hard sometimes to get a PhD in Sweden. There are many applicants, many
It's the first bottleneck. Yes, it is. Yeah, I was very lucky.
Yeah, not just luck, but yeah,
I mean, I
luck
believe luck is a combination of different things.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
not just divine intervention. There's
yeah.
a little more to it. I work hard for that,
Yeah.
but still, I felt lucky.
Okay, cool. So what was your PhD about then?
Well, my PhD was about 3 different subjects, roughly speaking. I was working on concepts and their life in academic and politics. So I've been kind of consolidating and furthering a field. It's like emerging. You have some scholars working here and there on it. But I guess my work is one of the first that really tries to make an effort to like connect it together and bring it into long conversation. And that's what I call the field of critical concept studies. A little bit leaning on critical security studies, so it's kind of a bit broader. Anyways, within that, I've been like furthering the notion of conceptual politics as a phenomenon that we should study. And that's something that I've defined then as the ways in which actors coin, use, promote, and revisit concepts, oftentimes in anticipation of performative effects. And then I've been basically using this framework that I developed, and I've applied it to the concept of soft power. It's a concept that was developed in the early 1990s as the ability to attract someone to your goals, and so you do not have to use coercion to get what you want. And this concept tends to be very misunderstood, in my opinion, in international politics, because some people say it's just a scientific concept, a way to think about the world, to measure power in the world. Others are quite harsh and say this is ineffective, banal window dressing. And others are saying, well, this is a benign foreign policy practice and something that's better than hard power or better than military or economic coercion. But here I show that through this framework of critical concept analysis of the soft power concept, and by looking at how it travels across time and space, that actually there's far more to it. There's a pronounced conceptual politics around this concept. And in the end of the day, it has really changed the world. And I really go into quite some detail to show all this interplay between the concept and the actors in the context. And so basically, as I follow this concept, I then end up in what I call the arena or the stage of soft power's trials and tribulations. And that's then the Asia Pacific. It's international relations in the Asia Pacific, and more specifically, the context of the ongoing power shift between the US and Japan and to China. And so basically, I demonstrate then that how the concept of soft power has changed the way power itself is understood, how its distribution is understood, or also what kind of forms of power are legitimate and what is necessary for a great power to have to be recognized as a great power. And that has become also soft power, for instance. And so basically, through this kind of understanding how the concept has then changed how we understand power, it has also changed the perception of states, how to prioritize their own foreign policy goals. So my individual chapters look at the fate of the concept in the US, in Japan, and in China. It really shows the impact of the concept also on the foreign policy and domestic policy there. And so in the end of the day, I show how it has kind of enabled what I call China's soft rise. Right, so there's a lot of assumptions within IR that if the state rises and another one declines, there's going to be conflict. And I kind of show how soft power interfered in that and has made it possible to think of a way for China to rise peacefully, but also for the US and Japan to decline peacefully. And that's a dynamic that I trace until around the mid-2015s, when relations have kind of soured and when also the relevance of soft power to the foreign policy of the states has declined. Yeah. So that's what my PhD is about.
Yeah, wow, interesting, very interesting, and very, very relevant. Soft power is also a concept that I think, at least in Malmö, many students from time to time would like to work with. It's a popular concept.
Very much so, yes. Yeah, it's basically since the inception of soft power, there's been, I think, 2 articles written every day or so.
Wow.
If you're looking at it. It's an amazing body of literature. Some better, some worse.
Okay, but is it okay if we unpack soft power a bit?
Absolutely.
and look at what it can mean and so on? So we have various scholars, right, that have developed different taxonomies or typologies of power. So we have Steve Lukes and the various phases of power, and we have Barnett and Duval and their distinction between coercive, institutional, structural, and productive power. And we could also distinguish between relational and structural power, as Susan Strange does. So with all this in mind, if we start with that, what type of power is soft power?
So there's like one move that I'm doing in the dissertation, which is to say that I treat the soft power concept entirely as an empirical object of analysis, right? So I say, you can do two things with concepts, right? You can look at them and you can kind of use it as some sort of glasses to understand the world. But you can also say, well, I want to understand those glasses and how they operate, and who are the people that wear those glasses, and what do they see when they wear those glasses? And that's more what I do, right? So I personally, in the dissertation, don't actually take any position on what soft power really is, or how we should really understand soft power. However, I look how the concept has really interacted with all of these forms of power. Because in a sense, there's a strong conceptual politics around what is power. And then you have these various different actors that come up with different taxonomies of what power is, that emphasize different aspects or resources that underpin power, etc. And so what soft power has done is to kind of repackage some of these things. In that sense, it kind of tends to fall, the way it's been used, it tends to fall between very standard type of, I have power in my pocket and I use it and therefore I expect results, which is perhaps the original coinage that Joseph Nye and some of those that are working closest to him have advocated.
Yes,
but then the concept traveled, right?
Yeah.
And so it has traveled, among other places, for instance, to a scholar called Lee, for instance, who's been writing on soft power as productive power. From there, it's been picked up also by some scholars here in Sweden, including, for instance, Linus Hagström. And to them, soft power has become something very different, right? To them, it's become really the way in which we kind of justify our state. In its foreign policy, it's kind of the stories we tell, it tends to be closer to framing reality and having others accept that reality. It's quite a distance that it traveled. So what interests me about this is, why do they call that soft power? How has that actually been possible, that the concept has taken these twists and turns, and that by this point you have this variations of soft power, in a sense, of actors that are trying to defend the hegemony of what soft power actually truly means.
Interesting. So, like you mentioned, then the understanding of soft power that Joseph Nye is focusing on is more of a relational power, then, and then perhaps soft power, as understood perhaps by Janice Bailey-Mattern, is more of a productive understanding of power, perhaps as soft power as productive power. But you emphasize something different. You emphasize looking at it really
as a thing.
Yes, and as a dependent variable.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes.
So this
also, there's a lot of puzzles around it. I can, like, for instance, you brought up the text by Janice Mattern, which is a very important text and really has done lots to invigorate soft power research. The interesting thing is, she wrote a book like the year before this article, Soft Power as Representation of Force, came out. And that book has absolutely no reference to soft power. But by the time she writes the article, soft power comes in there. And so a lot of what I'm doing is to demonstrate how taking the soft power concept and putting it into the work, or putting it into your constitution, as the Chinese have done, for instance, all of these things kind of do something in politics, right? It's a strategic maneuver, and it's a strategic maneuver that has academics involved in this, journalists, policymakers, and so on and so forth.
So this then relates to the distinction that Linus Hagström and Björn Jödén is doing, right? That there is power as capabilities, and we can look at power as effects.
Precisely, yes.
Yeah. And that is also relating to what you're doing in terms of the performative effects that you emphasize.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I've been dancing around this quite a bit in the dissertation, because in a sense, I am looking at the performative power of soft power. But that's a handful to pronounce, right? It's power everywhere. So I've been trying to like downplay the fact that this is a form of power that I'm looking at. And I've been downplaying, so to say, unpacking that precisely because I do not want to take the emphasis away from this move that I'm doing of placing soft power into the spotlight. But yeah, that is kind of how it occurs. And there's a lot of tension in the soft power concept from that perspective too. Because on the one hand, it's treated as something that's like an ultimate resource. You have a silo basically where you put in like soft power resources, like I don't know, your Hollywood movies, your jeans, your blue jeans, and so on and so forth. And then there's the idea like, oh, then that's an X amount of power you have. And then you get like these rankings of soft power, and it's supposed to tell you a lot about how international politics works. But at the same time, the same authors are always saying, oh, but it's a relation and we have to look at this. And it's very difficult to actually distinguish between that. And what I also like argue is that this has a lot to do with the fact that soft power does not just perform in academia, but it also performs in politics. So people have different expectations and usages for the concept. And some so-called concept entrepreneurs, especially Joseph Nye, have been very skilled in terms of pitching a concept in these different life worlds, right? And making sure that different audiences can take what they need. Then of course, once you like look in this and like try to figure it out, you'll notice there are some disambiguities there. So if that interests you, for instance, a very interesting conversation in a sense between Baldwin and Joseph Nye about soft power that's been spanning the last 3 or 4 decades, precisely on those questions.
Yeah, interesting, very interesting. So if we get down to the more empirical parts of your dissertation, so when it comes to soft power, what are some of the performative effects that Chinese and Japanese actors were anticipating?
So in the context of Japan, for instance, it is often said that Japan's embrace of soft power is very natural, right? Japan has a very popular pop culture. People like anime anyways. There's a lot to basically profit from. At the same time, Japan's constitution does not allow it to use force and to use war to settle its disputes. So it has a ban. It is not allowed to have an army and so on and so forth. And what I basically have been demonstrating here is that with the emergence of the soft power concept in Japan, and the fact that the concept was very heavily promoted into Japan's foreign policy and domestic policy too, we kind of start thinking of Japan as a soft power superpower, like one of these very famous publications in 2007. And the thing is, the moment you have such a strong association of Japan with soft power, a lot becomes possible. I talked earlier about how soft power is oftentimes seen as benign, right? And so one of my
articles, an article about that, right?
Exactly, it's a benign animal, right? So I really like this expression because yes, perhaps it's nicer than having military power and outright coercion. However, what I've really seen is that soft power, or like the pursuit of soft power, has become something that justifies a lot of Japan's foreign policy from all kinds of directions. Most importantly, it justifies some of the most controversial aspects of Japan's international security policy, such as, for instance, the US-Japan alliance. And here, all of a sudden, soft power becomes a justification for Japan to remain committed to the US as an alliance partner, right? That's what Japan can do, right? It doesn't have hard power, so it does a soft power. Therefore, it has to be in the alliance. It's a hard and a soft alliance that comes together. So it's a division of labor. It's a very interesting gender dimension there too that I never got to unpack. But the other aspect is also Japan's international responsibility. And so the fact that Japan has not been contributing very much to peacekeeping, for instance, aside from monetary contributions, has often been taken as a criticism of Japan. And then you have quite some savvy Japanese actors who said, well, we have to do all of these things so we have soft power, so we don't lose soft power. And hey, soft power is benign. And also, we only have soft power because we have no hard power. And so in a sense, in the name of soft power, how I call this, then anything becomes possible and becomes far easier to sell towards domestic and international audiences. So that's a situation in Japan where really you get to have someone like Shinzo Abe standing at the Rio de Janeiro Olympics and just like lift his Mario hat and like, Japan, it's funny. And people just like kind of like it. But then at the same time, there's some surprising hard security politics behind that kind of runs in its shadow, and that I think is quite important to unpack.
Interesting. Thank you for that elaboration. Yeah. Yeah, we can maybe we'll say some things about China later on, but we can continue with another question, because I don't know if it's possible to ask. I mean, it's possible to ask the question, of course, but can we say something? Can we observe some kind of discrepancy between anticipation and manifestation? I mean, did you find examples of when actors were anticipating certain performative effects, but they failed to materialize?
All the time.
Okay.
All the time. So I can connect that question maybe best actually in the China case study in a sense, right?
Yeah.
Because a lot of the soft power concept entrepreneurs have been very actively trying to promote the soft power concept into China, right? And so the idea is towards China, look, there's this concept here, and it's a very valid concept. This is how the world works. And this is what characterizes a great power. Now, China, if you would like to be a great power, you do need to have soft power. And so you have lots of concept entrepreneurs from outside of China, but very importantly, also from inside of China that really say, this is soft power. This is what we have to use. This is what we have to like achieve for China to maintain its rise. But of course, that is a very interesting form of politics, right? Of trying to steer the direction that China's rise takes, making sure that China prioritizes soft foreign policy goals, Confucius Institutes rather than tanks, for instance, right? And so that is kind of like the anticipated effect, right? If China was taking soft power seriously, then it would truly be a soft rise, right? So that's kind of the presumption. But then, of course, you get actors involved in this whole conceptual politics that you didn't necessarily want to be a part of it, perhaps, originally. So you have the Chinese Communist Party that at some point notices, oh, this is very popular. Oh, we have a lot of people domestically that are like really into this and like really advocating basically freedom for civil society to flourish, because otherwise there's no soft power. And so what you then see is how the Chinese Communist Party tries to steer the application of soft power in China through the explicit narrowing down of the concept to a cultural dimension. And so for people in China, it became very important to do research on anything cultural that can be leveraged in the name of soft power for China. And so you get all the stuff on pandas, on traditional flower picking, on Confucius, sayings, harmony, and so on and so forth, things that supposedly are very attractive about China then. But of course, that's not exactly the same soft power that originally was being perceived of. And so the concept kind of like runs somewhere else, and then you have all kinds of actors saying, this is what soft power is, this is what soft power is. And then in a sense, the concept entrepreneurs that are really like focused on the what I call democratic dimension of soft power, they really start to shepherd the concept, right? They really, from the beginning, you have a lot of freedom to like coin a concept and to frame it in whatever way you seem fit. But later on, of course, you'll have to engage those. You have to do so very carefully. You have to give them a little bit, but also push back on a little bit. And you really notice how the concept tries to run away into different kinds of places, such as only cultural dimension in China, which is really not what was originally anticipated. So yeah, in the role of like the concepts, more central concept entrepreneur, Joseph Nair really has changed from a coiner towards a defender in some ways. And you notice this, he keeps coming back saying, this is how it has to be understood. This is the legitimate, true understanding of soft power. And other actors such as China or also Russia just don't understand what it is about, and so on and so forth. But of course, no one owns the concept.
Yeah, fascinating. This understanding of soft power that we can find in China, is that related to the concept of discursive power?
It has, how do I say? Well,
I'm not an expert on the Chinese concept of discursive power, but I know that it exists there. Is it? Do they relate soft power to this Chinese notion of discursive power, or those two separate concepts?
They do, in a sense, yes. There's a relation there for sure, because in a sense, what the Chinese talk about discursive power actually kind of gets really close again to this idea of productive power or narrative power.
Yeah.
Right. So that's, if we're looking at it, of course, there's some differences, etc. But in general, it's kind of this idea that China has to tell stories and that people have to understand it.
Yeah.
And the soft power concept in that way is often seen as a prerequisite for China to be able to do so. But as I said earlier, the concept in a sense has peaked in China a while ago and has kind of given way to a new type of concept.
Okay.
And one which is discursive power and which doesn't actually have that package. Because the interesting thing with soft power is like when it originally came to China in the 1990s, we had two sort of translations, right? We had one translation, which was the one that you're familiar with, right? Basically there's soft power and you have like all these different like resources you can use for it, and it's important and it has something to do with great power politics, what have you. The other one that has been in China from the very beginning is the question of China's soft power as a so-called discursive trap. Because the very first translation of the book in China was actually from a military publishing house, and one that was very focused on making sure you understand the devious ways of other countries to try to change China. And so it was really translated with this idea that we have to be vigilant for this new concept because it's supposed to lead to a peaceful evolution in China, which is the idea of regime change through more softer means. And so from the very beginning, there has been also quite some suspicion within China towards this concept, right? And in a sense, of course, and that's, I think, somewhat of the beauty, if China was to buy into the original conception of soft power, the one that Joseph Nye and his friends stand for, then of course they would have to make civil liberties larger. They would have to stop human rights abuses. They would have to do all of these things. And in the end of the day, the only consequence of that, if it truly wants to have that soft power on those terms, is actually regime change. So it's not a crazy idea in the sense that they've seen that suspicion.
So in some sense, there is a valid suspicion there from these potentially hardcore realist militaries in China that this constructivist / liberal concept will be used against China.
Yes, that China is being tricked into believing this concept. There's a very beautiful cartoon that I found, which basically shows a book on soft power, which is like somewhere high up in the clouds, right? And so there's a throne on top, the soft power throne, basically. And there is a Westerner, which you can recognize because he has a long pointy nose, and he leads a Chinese person, the tiny person, right? He's small, he's not strong, he's not boisterous, he's very boyish. And the Western person is a big, long nose, strong, right? And he leads the Chinese and like, here, this is the soft power throne. This is where you sit. But the thing is, the book is tilted. And so the moment the Chinese would be sitting on that specific soft power throne, it would tip over and he would fall. Wow. That's kind of the idea of a discursive trap.
Interesting.
And that's also why the idea of discursive power has gotten so big in China, because they're frustrated that there's these terms, these liberal terms like soft power and so many other terms that are basically seen as just advocated towards China to smear China, as they say, or to trick China, or to like throw stones into its legitimate rise, or what have you.
So could you then see discursive power as some kind of attempt to indigenize the social sciences in China, to come up with Chinese concepts instead of importing these liberal Western concepts?
Yeah, in many ways it is. Yes, it's a strong movement within China to synthesize Western concepts, right? To have soft power with Chinese characteristics. And so there's some people that really argue like we should abandon this. This has no relevance for China. We need to have our own concepts, our own theories. In a sense, kind of this ties into the China school of IR, so to say, right? We shouldn't really like use Western concepts. We have something to contribute, but also our concepts are just working better or something along those lines. But then you also see again a little bit the power of the concept, because at the same time as there are these efforts, they also still can't quite shake off soft power either. And so you continuously still have some people who are like working on soft power, who are like justifying themselves in terms of soft power. It's kind of very interesting interplay there. We often think of China as an authoritarian state that's closed off to any genuine contestation, right? But then on soft power, we actually see genuine politics. It's not what we're used to, perhaps, in liberal democracies with open and free and fair elections. there's a lot of discussion about the course of the country and what it should and should not be doing. And soft power is quite caught in that.
Fascinating, fascinating. One last question in relation to soft power before I want to ask a few more questions or two more questions about your PhD. Even though power is understood as effects, or when we distinguish between power as capabilities and power as effects, when we treat it as the dependent variable, there must still be some resources, right? Or some capabilities even that have to be used to achieve the effects, right?
In principle, yes, yeah.
So there
nothing
is no
comes from nothing.
Yeah, so there is not necessarily a contradiction between power as capabilities and power as effects. They could be used.
Well, it's a question of translation, right? So in a sense, what those that are advocating for relational perspective argue is that you need resources, sure, but the more important thing is your capacity to transfer those resources into effects. That's where the real power lies. And I think I kind of tend to agree with that, because a concept such as soft power, let's presume that's like a resource of America, right? To have a concept in its silo. Depends on the actor to like take that concept and to like translate it and to pitch it and to make sure it actually does become part of the strategic culture of, let's say, Japan.
Okay, thank you very much. So, fascinating dissertation. Would really like to discuss more, but let's move on. So, what were some of the challenges that you encountered during the PhD process?
There's quite a few, obviously. I mean, I guess some are more like broad, right? I think you may also recognize it yourself. I always call this as like the highs are very high and the lows are very lonely. Does that make sense? The idea is like, if you have a moment of validation, it tends to be amazing, right? The moment of your defense, for instance, the thing that you work towards for many years. And then you have like, in my case, for instance, I think I had a very nice defense. I had a very good click with my opponent, and it was just a lot of fun. And I can go on and on talking about my dissertation. I really enjoy this. So this is a very high. But then the year after, or also before, if you get rejections, if you don't get good feedback, for instance, or if you're just not getting anywhere with your field work. When I was in China, for instance, I was living in a Chinese dormitory for a few months, and I was quite miserable because no one was talking to me, and I was just getting nowhere. And I was just like running up and down the streets of Beijing trying to figure out what to do about this. That was very solitary, right? So that can, I think, be quite a big challenge, the constant like sense of rejections. And it's also, I think, because a PhD is a long-term project and we don't really think so much about different milestones we have to reach, different goals we have to reach that we can basically tick off in a day or in a week, right? You don't have a sense of progress. And so I think my experience has been that until the very end, when I had tangible progress in terms of word count, that was increasing and increasing. For a very long time, you have a feeling like you're not getting anywhere. And I've seen this quite a bit with some of my colleagues too, who just basically really lack a sense of validation. Yeah. And then once you get it, it's really nice, but it is a lot of time you have to spend by yourself working, rehoning, and dealing with sometimes very harsh criticism. Yeah, exactly. It could be an anxious process. Yeah, and the critique is not always so easy to face. No, and it's often also that I feel not everyone knows necessarily how to give sufficient feedback. Like, it's not something we actually learn during our own PhD. Like, no one ever sits down and says, okay, let's think a little bit about how to provide feedback. And so I often experience many seminars, be it with my own text in the center of attention or other texts, that it's oftentimes more of a laundry list of problems that you'll have to resolve rather than suggestions on how to move forward. And that, I think, is something you do need some years to like work with and digest, so to say, because it can take it's not necessarily easy. I mean, in the end, it's fine. And in the end, like at the time I was finishing, I had my people, right? I had the ones that I knew I could give a text to, and I would actually get feedback that helps me really move forward, that really works with the text and tries to see like, okay, so how do we get from here to there? And of course, your supervisors do a lot of that. But then, of course, when someone says, like in my case, for instance, why would anyone still study soft power? That concept is so 2005. What do you say? I mean, what do you say, right? If you're like young and just started basically and just like have to justify the entire existence of your project, not the easiest.
Yeah, it's so 2005. I hope you sent the dissertation to that person afterwards with the award as well.
Luckily, it was just some random person at a conference.
Okay.
But it was and that's also the other thing, right? Like figuring out who are the people that matter and whose feedback actually matters. Like, who's your audience? Like, in 5 years finding my audience, and it took me a very long time to recognize who's my main audience and who are actually the ones that I need to persuade for my topic. Because it's very tempting, I think, in the PhD process to want to make sure that everyone agrees with your topic and your take, and that's just not going to happen. No. That's something you have to realize too.
Yeah, and you have to learn how to defend yourself.
Defending without being defensive. It's also a skill that takes a little time to learn.
Yeah, true. Thank you very much for sharing. Very insightful. Some recommendations for students contemplating doing a PhD, perhaps something you would like to share.
In international relations.
In IR.
Well, don't do it because it gives you 5 years of a guaranteed job. I think that is perhaps the one thing that it was not in my case, to be honest, but I've seen this quite a lot with people that are interested in a PhD or people that are in a PhD that really do this because they are after the master's degree and just try to figure out what is the next step. And then, of course, with the skill set of a master, in a sense, it's very easy to see how this can lead to a PhD. Whereas unless you want to work in academia, a PhD in IR is not something that is necessarily going to increase your chances on the regular labor market. Like if you want to work for a ministry, for instance, of course, a PhD is nice, but it's not necessarily something that will raise your salary or that will raise your capabilities. So I think that's the first thing, right? Like just inform yourself what it actually does to your labor chances and what it actually means to like work in academia and what it takes. Because what I've noticed is also with a lot of my colleagues, perhaps, that I'm sharp so that my camera focuses. So I've seen that quite some are like not really thinking so much what comes next, right? For them, it's like this very nice bubble of the PhD. And once you are done and you're finished, you're kind of scrambling, trying to figure out your next steps. And in a sense, I started thinking at some point that one really needs to think about the next steps in the first day of a PhD. Because if you're not 100% sold on the fact that you want to be an academic and only think and work towards this kind of academic lifestyle, and if you're, for instance, not willing to move city or move country, if you like prioritize a family, I mean, those are things that maybe not so important when you're in your 20s and you start on a PhD. But around 30, maybe you feel like I want to kind of settle down. But then like maybe the follow-up position is not in Sweden, for instance, or maybe you have to like move to a different continent, and maybe your partner, and like in my case, he's an academic, right? And so now we're like in a situation where we both try to find a city where we can both work and remain in academia. And like we knew these things coming into this, but I don't necessarily think so many people know that. And so if that's the case, by all means, continue doing a PhD, but be aware of this and think maybe a little bit about what kind of skills you can get throughout the PhD and how you can relate those skills towards other jobs too. Become a data manager. Like if you feel like this is something you can do big data analysis as your research method. Think about how your research methods might fit other fields too. If you're able to do network analysis, you have a very broad applicability. So I very heavily come down on the side of the strategist. I know many people are more the idealist, right? You have so much time to study and to think and explore and do what you like, and the rest will follow. And I'm a little bit more grounded than that, I suppose. But yeah, that would be definitely something that I recommend. Like, know what you're doing, and also I think know that you're not going to get a lot of validation in terms of a high salary, in terms of job security, or in terms of external recognition. And so if either of those is an issue, you really need to think about whether academia is really what you want, and whether you get enough of a kick out of doing what you do to be able to offset all of these other aspects.
Thank you very much for that recommendation. Very good advice. And I think this is it, actually. It has been a true honor to speak to you. Fascinating dissertation. And thank you very much for
speak about it.
Yeah, thank you very much for participating.
Absolutely.
Take care. All the very best. Bye-bye.
Bye.